The desert held its breath. Morning spilled across the bone-colored earth, touching every rock and thornbush with the pale gold of a sun that never asked why. In the stillness, she lay trapped in silence, her body buried beneath the dust like a secret the town was too ashamed to keep above ground. Only her face was left exposed, sunburnt and dry, framed by the cruel rim of the pit they'd made with shovels and scripture. Her eyes, hollow with thirst, blinked slow against the light, like a child blinking away a nightmare she was still inside. They said she was cursed. No man should marry a woman whose womb grows weeds instead of wildflowers. No woman should walk among others if she cannot bear the proof of God's favor in the swell of her belly. And when the months passed with nothing but quiet between her and the cradle, the elders muttered. The women looked away. The man she was given to, the preacher, bone-thin and brittle-voiced, began to pray louder and strike faster. He told her the devil had placed a cold stone in the place of her seed. That only fire or dirt could burn it out. They chose dirt. She remembered the morning they dragged her. No screams. Just her bare feet scratching against dry ground. Her mother, long gone. Her father, one of the ones holding the rope. She hadn't fought. Not because she agreed, but because she'd already stopped believing in being heard. They left her there before sunrise. Said if the Lord willed her worthy, He'd send rain or ravens or revelation. If not, the sun would see her gone by noon. Now, as the wind stirred her tangled hair, her lips cracked in two. She wanted to cry, but even her tears had turned to dust. The sky above stretched endless and cruel, a ceiling too far away to hear her prayers. Somewhere, a crow cawed. Somewhere, her name faded from memory like a smudged word on a church slate. She no longer feared death. She feared nothingness. Being forgotten. Being turned into a story whispered by firelight, the kind that ends with asterisk. And they never found her bones. Asterisk. She closed her eyes. Then came the sound. A soft creak of leather. The slow rhythm of hooves brushing sand. Not many. 4 maybe. 1 rider. The sun was behind him. All she saw was shadow. She squinted through the light, thinking it a dream. Maybe death came wearing spurs. But the horse stopped. The rider dismounted. She heard boots crunch the grit, steady and calm, like he was walking across the porch of his own home. A tall figure approached, dust-covered and broad-shouldered. The wind caught his hat brim, lifted it slightly, revealing a face carved by sun and time. He crouched. They stared at one another for a long moment. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. He said nothing. Not yet. His gaze scanned her face, the dried blood at the corner of her lip, the hollow of her cheeks. His expression didn't change. No disgust. No pity. Only quiet recognition. As if he'd expected to find her, and now that he had, he would not waste time wondering why. He stood, took off his coat, and gently draped it over her head and shoulders, shielding her from the sun. Then, without ceremony, he reached for a small shovel strapped to his saddle. She drifted in and out after that. A haze of heat and shadow. The sound of metal biting earth. Again and again. He never stopped. The hours passed. His hands bled. Still he dug. When the earth finally gave her up, she didn't feel it. She only noticed the absence of pressure. Then the warmth of arms beneath her, the jostle of being lifted, her head resting against something solid and real. The steady beat of a heart. Not hers. He mounted his horse with her in his arms, balanced her like something sacred across his lap, and turned toward the west. The sun dipped behind the hills as they rode, painting the world in long shadows and amber hues. She barely noticed the jolt of the trail. The wind kissed her face. She did not sleep, but she stopped worrying if she'd wake. The cabin came into view at dusk, tucked beneath a slope of cottonwoods, its chimney drawing a lazy line of smoke into the sky. A dog barked once. Chickens rustled in the coop. Everything was still. Alive, but quiet. Like the house itself was holding its breath. He carried her inside, not asking permission, as if it was already understood that she belonged somewhere better than a hole in the ground. The hearth glowed. The floor creaked. He placed her on a cot near the fire, covered her in a worn quilt that smelled faintly of pine. Still, no words. Only the sound of soup warming, bread sliced, water poured. He knelt beside her, holding a cup to her lips. She drank. Choked. He waited. Tried again. Bit by bit, her throat remembered how to swallow. That night, she lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his breath across the room. A calm kind of silence. Not the silence of fear or absence, but of something unspoken and whole. He had not asked her name. He had not spoken his. Yet she felt safer than she had in years. In the flickering firelight, she studied the rough beams above her, the tools hung with care along the wall, the boots resting by the door. This was not a home built for comfort, but for endurance. And still, there was something tender in its corners. A basin of fresh water left by her bed. A folded cloth. A pair of slippers she hadn't worn but noticed. She turned her head slightly and looked toward him. He sat in a wooden chair, leaning forward, elbows on knees, watching the flames. His profile was marked by the kind of wear that came not from age, but from grief. She understood that. Even without words, she knew they were alike. Both buried. Both pulled from the dirt by something unexpected. Not mercy. Not fate. Choice. As the fire softened to coals, and the world slipped once more toward sleep, she let her eyes fall shut. She did not know who he was, or why he'd chosen to stop. But she knew this. She was no longer alone. The morning came slow, pouring gold through the gaps in the wooden slats like syrup over worn cloth. She woke to the smell of coffee and something frying in a pan, the scent pulling her gently back to a world she hadn't yet decided to trust. Her limbs ached from days spent buried, but they moved. Her throat, still sore, remembered how to swallow. She sat up in the cot, quilt slipping from her shoulders, and blinked toward the kitchen. He stood at the stove, back to her, frying pan in one hand, spatula in the other. The light touched the side of his face, sharp jaw, sun-darkened skin, the edges of someone shaped by long solitude. He didn't turn to speak. Just said low and even, "There's water on the table. And more bread if you're ready." She glanced at the table. A bowl, clean and full. A plate of rough slices of bread beside it. No one had asked her if she was ready before. She slid off the cot, her bare feet finding a small rug. Her knees wobbled beneath her, but she caught the table edge before she fell. The pain grounded her. Sitting down, she took the bread in shaking fingers, broke it gently in half. Ate slow. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was considerate. Like he knew how noise could feel like pressure. He served her eggs and potatoes without a word, setting the plate before her and pouring coffee into a tin cup. Then he sat across from her, arms resting on the table, not eating, just sipping his own coffee. Watching, but not intrusively. Just present. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. He waited. Finally, she managed. "Why did you stop?" A moment passed. He looked down into his cup, then out the window, where wind shifted through the trees. "I don't ride past something that don't belong in the dirt," he said simply. "And you didn't." There was no dramatic swell behind the words. No sermon. Just plain truth. She didn't know whether to cry or thank him. So she did neither. "Your name?" she asked quietly. He set down his cup. "Silas." She let the name settle in the air. It fit him, solid, weathered, a little lonesome. "I'm..." She paused. Even now, the name felt like someone else's. "Mara." He nodded, like he already knew. Later that morning, she followed him outside. He didn't offer to take her. He only opened the door, left it that way, and trusted her to decide. The sun was warm but not cruel, filtered through a sky washed clean by the night. Chickens clucked from behind a rough wooden coop, and in the distance, 4 horses grazed within a modest fence, their tails swaying slow, unconcerned. Silas moved among them with quiet purpose. Fixing a broken rail. Adjusting a latch. Feeding the hens. Mara watched from the porch at first, then stepped down and began to help without asking. She swept the steps, gathered eggs, carried buckets. The work was slow, the kind that gave your mind room to breathe. And he didn't treat her like a guest. Or like someone broken. He handed her tools, nodded at her tasks. It was the first time in a long while she'd been allowed to do something, instead of simply be judged. As the sun climbed higher, Silas wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and turned to her. "You need boots," he said. "These stones ruin your feet." She looked down at the thin slippers he'd given her, now stained with dirt. "I'll manage," she murmured. He nodded once and didn't push. Just went back to working the latch. In the evening, after dinner, again shared in silence, but a companionable kind, she sat on the porch while he fed the horses. The land was quiet in a way that didn't frighten her anymore. Crickets began their evening songs. A wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like soft voices telling old stories. Mara curled her knees beneath her and watched him move, methodical, efficient, unhurried. There was strength in him, yes, but something else. Something steadier. He carried pain the way some men carry tools, worn from use but useful still. She wondered what had hollowed him out. The lines on his face said it had been love, once. He returned and sat on the steps beside her, not too close. "You have people?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Had. Once." He didn't pry. Just sipped from his cup. "My husband," she said softly, "wasn't much of one." Silas nodded again. As if he understood that sometimes a few words held entire years. She hesitated, then added, "They said I was barren. Cursed. A woman not worth the soil she walks on." His jaw shifted slightly. He didn't look at her when he replied. "Sometimes land don't bloom because it's bad land," he said. "Sometimes it don't bloom because it's been beaten, starved, bled dry." She looked at him, startled. "Doesn't mean it's dead," he added after a beat. "Just means it needs rest. Kindness. Maybe a little rain." She had no words to answer that. Only a warmth behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in years, she slept a full night through. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm. Silas worked the land, repaired the roof, prepared for the coming storms. Mara helped more each day. She learned the habits of the hens. Learned which fence posts leaned and how to right them. The soreness in her limbs was a quiet kind of reward. He didn't hover. He didn't praise or coddle. But he noticed. One afternoon, as she carried firewood in her arms, he passed her with a short nod. "Strong back," he said. She smiled despite herself. "Better than being called cursed." He stopped then, looked at her fully. "You're not cursed," he said. "You're just alive. And that don't sit right with folks who gave up living long ago." She turned those words over like smooth stones in her hand. The world beyond the valley didn't intrude. Not yet. The hills stood between them and the past. But inside her, something stirred. Not fear. Not yet hope. Just space. On the 6th day, she found herself humming. It surprised her. She couldn't even place the tune. It had come from somewhere deep, like a memory of who she was before the silence. Silas heard it, but didn't say anything. Only paused in his work, then continued, slower this time. Like he didn't want the music to stop. That night, as they sat beside the fire, he asked, "You planning to stay long?" She hesitated. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I didn't think I'd live this far." He nodded. "Well, there's time still." She looked into the flames, the way they licked and curled and held their shape even when everything else around them moved. "I think I'd like to learn to plant something," she said, barely above a whisper. He didn't smile. But something shifted in his eyes. A gentling. "We'll start with tomatoes," he said. And just like that, the girl they tried to bury began to return to the earth, not as ash or shame, but as something that might grow. The rain came like a soft forgiveness, tapping lightly on the tin roof in a rhythm that made the whole cabin feel like it was breathing. Mara stood by the open door, barefoot on the threshold, her arms wrapped around her middle as if holding herself steady against the pull of something old and unfamiliar. She stepped outside slowly, the porch cool beneath her feet, and tilted her face to the sky. Droplets kissed her cheeks and rolled down her neck, trailing over skin that had not been touched without harm in years. Behind her, the fire crackled low, casting a warm pulse into the room. Silas sat at the table, a small knife in one hand, carving a piece of cedar with patient, focused movements. He did not call her back inside. He only glanced at her once through the open door, then returned to the rhythm of his hands. She didn't know why the rain moved her so deeply. Perhaps because it felt like the sky had wept on her behalf. Or maybe because no one was forcing her indoors. No voice was shouting her away from the world. She was allowed to stand in it now, even if soaked, even if silent. Later, she returned inside, hair damp and clinging to her skin, cheeks flushed not from shame but from something close to awe. She met Silas's gaze, and he nodded once. There was something in that simple motion, an understanding. He hadn't said a word, yet she felt spoken to. That night, she could not sleep. Her thoughts were too loud. She sat at the table, watching the rain streak down the windowpane, blurring the shapes of the world outside. The storm was gentle, not violent. Still, it stirred old aches. She turned toward Silas, who was still whittling by the fire, and spoke without warning. "They said my womb was a grave," she murmured. "That I swallowed life instead of giving it." He didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Just set the carving down and leaned back in his chair. "That's a cruel thing to say to anyone," he said. "It was the preacher," she continued. "My husband. I never called him that aloud, but he was, by law. By God, they said. He used to pray over me with hands that bruised." Her voice cracked. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if trying to catch the words before they turned into tears. "I used to wonder," she whispered, "if maybe I was broken. If maybe God made a mistake with me." Silas's voice came quiet, but steady. "You don't fix something that ain't broken. You just give it time. Give it a place to breathe." She looked at him through the dark. "You really believe that?" He met her gaze. "I believe no one should be punished for how they carry pain." The silence that followed was warm, not awkward. As if he'd handed her a blanket of words and let her decide how tightly to hold it. Over the next days, the rhythm of their lives deepened. Mornings were slow, filled with the smell of wood smoke and the soft sounds of chores beginning. Mara rose earlier now, helping Silas mend fences, gather feed, carry buckets. Her hands grew rougher, her back stronger. And in that work, something shifted inside her. One morning, they found a mare in labor. She had strayed to the far edge of the pasture, hidden in a grove of juniper. Silas spotted her first, and together they moved through the high grass, careful and calm. The mare was struggling. Too long in labor, the foal turned wrong. Mara knelt in the dirt without hesitation. Her palms moved with surprising confidence, guided by instinct more than knowledge. Silas was beside her, murmuring instructions she didn't need. She touched the mare's flank, spoke softly, and reached inside to guide the foal. The birth was messy, primal, painful. But when it was over, the foal lay breathing on the earth, legs folded, eyes blinking at the new world. Mara sat back on her heels, blood on her arms, hair falling loose from its braid. Silas looked at her, really looked, and something in his face changed. "You've got healer's hands," he said. She blinked at him, then at the foal, then back to her own shaking fingers. "No," she said softly. "I just didn't want her to die. That's what healing is." They walked back to the cabin in silence, the smell of birth and hay clinging to them. Mara washed her hands in the basin while Silas started the fire. She caught her reflection in the water, mud-streaked, tired, alive. That night she asked him a question. "Do you think people can be born again? Not in church words. Real ones?" Silas stirred the fire and thought a moment. "I think some people are born more than once," he said. "The hard part is surviving all the deaths in between." Mara felt those words lodge somewhere deep, like seeds caught between ribs. She carried them with her the next day, and the next. One afternoon, she wandered behind the cabin where the wildflowers grew. She hadn't noticed them before, too focused on survival. But now, they called to her, stubborn things, blooming where no one expected beauty. She knelt among them, ran her fingers over their petals, and let herself wonder what else she had missed while buried. Silas came to find her there, not to fetch her, just to sit beside her in the grass. "You don't talk much," she said after a while. He shrugged. "I listen better." "To what?" "The way people breathe. The way they stop talking when they're afraid. The way they ask for help without saying it." She turned toward him, eyes narrowing slightly. "And what did you hear in me?" He hesitated. Then said, "A heart still beating. Even if you couldn't hear it yourself." She looked back to the flowers. Her voice was quiet. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Well," he replied, "maybe they never really looked." A long pause stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them had the words for yet. The wind rose, stirring the petals. The sky shifted from blue to amber. Mara spoke again, softer now. "I used to dream of running," she said. "Not toward anything. Just away." "And now?" he asked. "I think—" She paused, tasted the truth. "Now I dream of staying." He didn't smile. But his hand brushed hers, gentle as a question. And she didn't pull away. The hills had long kept them hidden, a soft and patient shield between the cabin and the world beyond. But nothing stays untouched forever. The wind changed. Not in sound, but in weight. The trees leaned different. Even the birds went quiet before dawn. It was a stillness Mara felt in her bones before she ever saw the letter. It arrived folded and sealed with red wax, pressed flat against a saddlebag and delivered by a boy too young to know the meaning of what he carried. Silas accepted it with no expression, only a slow nod. The boy didn't stay long. He muttered something about returning by nightfall and rode off without waiting for a reply. Silas didn't open it in front of her. He carried it into the cabin like it was a thing that stung, placed it gently on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Mara stood by the doorway, arms crossed against the tightness rising in her chest. She already knew who had sent it. There were only so many men who signed things in red. "Is it from him?" she asked, her voice low. Silas nodded once. Her breath caught. The preacher. Her husband by name, if not by soul. The man who had her buried for being barren. The one who looked at her like she was a vessel meant to be filled, then punished when she remained her own. Silas finally broke the seal. He read it silently, his eyes narrowing with each line. When he was done, he folded it again and set it in the fire. The flames took it fast, curling the corners into black feathers. "What did it say?" she asked. He looked up. "He wants you returned." The words landed like cold iron. Not requested. Not pleaded. Wants. As if she were a stray cow, a lost possession. "By what right?" she whispered. "By the law he claims to speak for," Silas replied. "By fear. By habit. By control." She turned from him, her hands curling at her sides. The anger was not new, but the permission to feel it was. And now it rushed through her like wildfire. "I'm not going back," she said. "I know." He said it as simply as sunrise. No drama. No fight. Just the truth. But Mara also knew the kind of men the preacher led. Men who covered fists with righteousness. Men who wore violence like a second skin. If he had sent a letter, it was only the first step. Words always came before footsteps. And footsteps always came before fire. Over the next days, the air grew thick with waiting. Silas didn't speak of the letter again, but Mara watched the way he moved, quiet, alert. He reinforced the barn door, double-checked the hinges on every window. He oiled his rifle without urgency, the way one might mend a broken gate. There was no panic in him, only preparation. The land was still, but it felt like holding a breath. Mara helped without being told. She packed dried herbs into small cloth bundles, checked the pantry, boiled water, laid clean linens over the spare cot. She didn't ask if it was for tending wounds or for running. She just did what needed doing. One afternoon, while gathering eggs, she looked up to find an old woman watching her from the edge of the field. Her back was bent, hair long and silver, eyes sharp as flint. "Neighbor," the woman said. Her voice was dry but not unkind. Mara straightened, cautious. "Yes, ma'am. Heard you was dead." Mara offered a small smile. They tried. The woman stepped closer, her gaze heavy with something like approval. "You the one from down valley? The preacher's girl?" "Not anymore," Mara said. The woman spat into the dirt. "Good." They stood in silence for a long moment. "You got a name?" Mara asked. "Agnes," the woman said. "I live past the ridge. Been watching that man you're with a long while. He don't say much, but he don't turn away from pain neither." Mara nodded. "He dug me out." Agnes looked her over. "And now you did yourself back in." There was a pause, then Agnes added, "If trouble comes, send a light toward my ridge. I don't care much for men like your old one." With that, she turned and walked off, her pace slow but sure. Mara stood in the field, the eggs warm in her hands, and felt something settle. A kind of strength that came not from muscle but from being seen. That night, she sat on the porch beside Silas. The stars had come out early, scattered like broken glass across the sky. "You ever run from anything?" she asked. He thought for a long while. "I ran once," he said. "From grief. Thought if I buried myself in quiet, it couldn't find me." "Did it?" He nodded. "Found me anyway. Sat right beside me and waited." She looked down at her hands, now calloused and lined with dirt. "I don't want to run," she said. "Not now. You won't have to," he said. She glanced at him, the lantern light casting half his face in shadow. "Even if they come?" He met her eyes. "Especially if they come." There was a finality in his voice that comforted her more than any promise ever could. He would not let them take her. Not because she was his, but because she was herself now. A woman unburied. A life reclaimed. And she believed him. Still, the wind was restless. And though the hills still stood, she could feel the old world creeping toward them. Before bed, she placed a single oil lamp on the windowsill facing the ridge. A quiet signal. Just in case. She slept with her boots beside the bed that night, just in case. She dreamed of the preacher's face, his smile thin and full of teeth, his voice wrapped in honey and venom. But when he reached for her in the dream, his hand passed through her like smoke. And she woke up, not afraid. They came at dawn. The earth had barely stirred from night's stillness when the sound began. Low thunder on the horizon, not of storm but of hooves, the kind that carried judgment and fury. Mara heard it before she saw them, lying wide-eyed in bed, staring at the ceiling as the air around her thickened with dread. She rose without trembling, her body no longer the same one that had once been buried in the earth like a discarded thing. This body had purpose now. It knew what to do. Silas was already outside. She stepped to the porch in her boots and shawl, hair braided down her back. The wind moved through the grass like it was whispering warnings, but she didn't flinch. The horses were visible now, descending the ridge, half a dozen men behind them. In the lead, tall in the saddle, clothed in dark wool and rage, rode the preacher. He looked unchanged. Older, perhaps, but still built like a man who had never questioned his right to power. His beard was thick, his eyes sharp, his hands white on the reins. Behind him, the others rode in silence. Townsmen. Witnesses. Cowards. Mara didn't need to see their faces to know they hadn't come to talk. Silas stood with one hand resting on the post of the porch. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't shout. He simply watched, the way the mountains watch the weather, calm, unmoved, steady. The men drew to a halt at the gate. The preacher was the first to speak. "You've taken what's mine," Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stillness around him said enough. The preacher looked past him to Mara. His eyes narrowed, voice turning to ash. You come now, girl. You walk back of your own will, and this ends clean. I won't ask again. Mara stepped forward. Her feet felt heavy, not with fear, but with all the weight she'd carried for too long. Her voice, when she used it, came low but unwavering. I am not yours. The preacher's lip curled. By law. There is no law in burying a woman alive, she said louder now. There is no law in calling cruelty holy. There is only fear. And I'm done being afraid of men like you. The silence was absolute. One of the horses shifted. Mara took another step. You buried me. And still I lived. You burned my name, and still I speak. You tried to hollow me out. But I am more full now than I have ever been. The preacher leaned forward in the saddle, voice like a hiss. You think this man can protect you? One man against all of us? No, Mara said. I protect myself now. Silas stepped beside her then, not to shield her, but to stand with her. There was no grand gesture. No raised gun. Just the quiet presence of a man who had chosen her, not to possess but to honor. The preacher's gaze flicked to Silas. You'll regret this, he spat. Silas's voice was quiet. You already do. A movement came from the trees. Agnes stepped out first, rifle slung across her shoulder. Then another man, and another, farmers, widows, a few older boys, folks from the outer hills who'd heard the wind and read the sky. They didn't speak. They didn't cheer. But they stood behind Silas and Mara, eyes sharp, shoulders square. The preacher looked around, sensing the shift. What once had been silence born of fear was now a silence full of resistance. This ain't your concern, he growled. It is, Agnes said. When you start burying girls like weeds and call it gospel, it's everyone's concern. His horse snorted, anxious. You bring fire, we bring water, she added. Try to burn this place, we'll flood you out. For a moment, the preacher looked like he might dismount, make a show of strength, but even he could see it was done. The power he held in that valley had dried up, like a well poisoned by its own water. He turned his horse. This isn't over, he muttered. Mara raised her chin. It already is. And with that, they rode away, less like judges, more like men who had lost something they never understood. The dust settled. The silence returned. But it was no longer heavy. Mara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her knees wanted to buckle, but she stood tall, shoulders square. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes was something wordless and vast. Not pride. Not pity. Just awe. The others left quietly, tipping hats, nodding. No celebration. Just the quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. Later, she and Silas sat by the fire, either needing to fill the space with words. He carved. She stitched. The world outside was still the same, and yet completely different. Finally, he said, You didn't need me. I did, she replied softly. But not to fight for me. Just to show me I was worth fighting for. He looked at her, eyes warm. You always were. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not out of exhaustion, but belonging. And there, in the still flicker of firelight, the dust of the past settled for good. Not gone. Not forgotten. But laid to rest. She was not barren. She had planted something in the wild. And it was growing.